when I think about conferences, I've kind of changed a little bit over the years how I think about it. I started going to conferences as a graduate student, just as you were. Made 4, 5, or 6 conferences before I graduated. And I thought of myself as walking in and basically taking the papers that I had already written and shrinking them down to a small, it's almost like I ran it through a machine that would just take what would have taken probably 25 minutes to 30 minutes to read, and maybe more, and shrink it down to this very tight, small, said very fast paper that was basically saying it all in 10 or 15 minutes. Because you basically don't generally have more than about 10 or 15 to talk. You really don't, unless there's some special formatting that, no matter whether it's a big or small conference, just the timing usually works out that way. And I discovered when I tried to do that, it just didn't communicate particularly well. I did have to speak very, very fast. And you know, it wasn't a particularly successful experience for me or for the audience. So I think about a presentation differently now. One way I think about it is it's an advertisement for my work. So if nothing else happens, by the time I leave the room and by the time they leave the room, either by me presenting or interacting around it, they should have at least gotten a taste of what's in there, enough to know that they either want to read it or they don't. They want to get hold of the whole thing or not. And there's generally needs to be some way to get hold of the whole thing. I don't always bring the whole thing in, but in the first 20 years of going to conferences, I probably always did. I would have 15 or 20 copies of something, and there might be one person, and there might be 6, or there might be 50. And you could never predict in the conferences I went to, which were typically big national research conferences. But I always brought something in. And in the more recent years, I've tended to bring in a kind of shorter synopsis, like a 6 to 8 page version of the thing, or sometimes just a copy of a handout of the PowerPoint slides. I often use PowerPoint, but not always. So I bring in something, and sometimes it's a handout. And the something always tries to have my email on it, so that there is a way that they can walk out, having been so advertised, to get in touch with me and get the whole thing. So that's kind of the habit that I've come to now. So advertisement for your work is one way to think about it. Another is a selection from your work, something you pulled out of this piece that you want to present that you think is particularly interesting given who the audience is. And you're always thinking who the audience is. Your audience is different. So what would be really interesting, enticing kind of thing that you produced? And give them enough of that to get their teeth into it and be intrigued and want to know farther. I also think of presentations as a chance to interact. Now, the formats for many conferences that I go to don't encourage that. They're pretty much sit and get, stand and deliver, one-way communication, now you, now me, and you know, that's often the format. But still, there is the potential to interact, either in the Q&A part, if that's how it's set up, sometimes among the panelists or the presenters, sometimes, depends on the chair, and always in the hallway outside, and always in, you know, at the end coming up and buttonholing me. So I think of the presentation as just a way to open that door and try to have a conversation or a bit of a conversation about the work. So those are kind of ways I think about presenting now, and a few of the things that I do. And I scribbled other things down, but why don't you guys talk, and I'll jump in and we'll just keep talking until we get interrupted.
So I'm not sure if there's any general, because when I prepared, I kind of thought, okay, tips for before you start, like just because there's the mental aspect of it, like just building your confidence to get to the national presentation conference, and then there's also the tips in terms of the actual presentation, what am I going to be doing at that moment, and then there's also the aspect of applying and getting in, right? So I wasn't sure where y'all were. Sounds like some of you are at more of the, you've already gotten in, and then maybe the first part, I'm not sure what you want to hear exactly, but feel free to ask. Because overall, I'll just say briefly on a few and then just tell us a little more. But when I was thinking of just mentally preparing to get to a national conference, for me it was very helpful to start local and to start at so I heard that somebody was doing something more local, and I think that's a great place to start. Also, what I did is I first presented my research at a NOX conference, which is the National Association for Chicanos and Chicano Studies, and it was very local, small space, and I think, you know, you do expect like 5 to 8 people there, and that was perfect, and it's very, they're very nurturing, and it was a very, you know, the smaller conferences tend to be more like they're there to help you kind of thing, the audiences anyways. So that is kind of just building your confidence is a piece of it, is just kind of to do that, think about how can you, if you feel that you need to build your confidence, and think of what are the different places that I can go to practice and just present. So whether it's at small conferences, another way is starting with a poster presentation and then moving into an oral presentation. I found that also is useful because I presented first at ASH in a poster, and then eventually I presented with an oral. So it's kind of, you know, it's a little bit less stress in terms of 30 people watching you, or 10 people or 5 people watching you at once, whereas just more interactive and can really play off of the people that are looking at your poster. In terms of presenting, I would say that definitely knowing your audience. So some of you mentioned you have different audiences. It's really important to do your research in terms of who is the conference usually for. Also thinking about the length of the presentations. Oftentimes the chairs will send you information about how much time they're going to give you, but if you don't hear from them, try to reach out and find out. I had a friend of mine who said once, he went to I asked him about this one conference he presented at, and he said, you know, one thing he didn't realize until he got there was that he actually got 60 minutes to present. So he thought it was going to be 10 minutes. And it was a national, like, I forget which one it was one of the Hispanic conferences, because the target audience are administrators, so it's more like a workshop style. And so he was out there to present his research, you know, a grad student, and he was just like, whoa, it was like 60 minutes. And so he made it work, but it was something that you want to make sure you kind of maybe research a little bit ahead of time, because we can't always expect it to be what we thought it, you know, the traditional stuff that I've been has been usually like 10, 12 minutes max that they give you time to talk about.
So what I have is like some practical tips. So it's kind of like a different, but I'm going to give you a story first. My very first conference, I was a graduate student. I started at graduate student conferences, which was a great way for me to start. And it was horrible. I did a horrible job. I memorized, I practiced it so much, I had it memorized, and so I could do this. And I never stopped. There was no inflection in my voice. It was the discussant had nothing to say. The audience had nothing to say. I sped through it. So my point. It can't be worse than that, right? So no, that it can't be worse than what I've personally experienced, and I turned out okay. But I was really nervous, and this was a graduate student conference, you know. But I'd never done anything like that before, ever. I'd never been like a Sunday school teacher. I just had never taught. I'd never had a public. And it was literally, nobody had anything to say afterwards, because I don't think anybody even understood the word mouth, because I sped through it. So, practical tips, what I try and do and what I like in presentations. One, don't talk about what you don't know. If you have a passing familiarity with it, don't pretend that you have a deeper understanding, because you will get busted. I've seen it happen. I'm not talking about graduate students, I'm talking about faculty. I have seen it happen. So don't try and impress your audience with throwing names in or concepts. Stick to what you know. That's how you got on the program. Don't masquerade. I'm telling you, you'll get busted. It'll be ugly. Practice. Don't just, literally out loud. Not as much as I did. Like, you don't need to memorize every word on the page. But you have to practice. One, because I can guarantee you it will be too long. It takes a long time to, people say it's like 2.5 minutes per page. It depends on your cadence. It depends on if you ad lib here. It depends on a lot of things. If you're making contact with the audience, I guarantee you it will be too long. So you have to practice it out loud and time yourself. And I actually suggest practicing it in front of an audience. so they can give you some questions. Like, encourage that audience who are going to be your friends to ask you questions about it. And so I know in foundations, we've had students who are going to national conferences, and we organize a little group of us. And so the faculty and other students are there, and we give them feedback on not just we don't ask them questions just about the content like what you would usually get at a conference, but we would say, this point got lost here. Remember to emphasize this. Another thing is remember, so I'm a historian, so technology is the blackboard as far as historians are. The blackboard was an amazing feat in technology and teaching, by the way. When you present orally, you have to remember it's different from written language. Oral language is different than written language. I get lost when, usually when I read an article, that's not the way I want to deliver it if I'm hearing it. I need shorter words, fewer syllables. You have to be able to, you shouldn't just cut your paper, your research paper, and then merge those paragraphs together. You have to pay attention to the difference between written and oral speech. Also, you have to pay attention to, so I don't use PowerPoints, and I don't have PowerPoint slides, don't roll like that. When you speak, you need oral markers, so people know where you are in your presentation. It's harder to follow than when it is written. And so I use first, second, third, say first, and then, I use all of those as markers because the audience likes to know where you are in your presentation. And I like to be very specific in where I'm taking this presentation. In writing, your introduction can be 2 pages long, which probably is too long for an introduction, by the way. But in a presentation, it should be compact. And the audience should understand where you're going, where you're taking them, and then where you've been. So you have to remember that when you're delivering the talk. Like it's the difference between written and oral. Look up. One of my biggest pet peeves at conferences is looking at the top of people's heads when they read with no inflection from the page. And then they move on to the next section. That drives me crazy. Nobody came here to look at the top of your head. You know it. This is about confidence. You know it. Practice it. But make content. You think about how you want to be taught, what you want to see in a presentation. And try, if you're comfortable with it, definitely stay in your comfort zone. Some people like to write it all out. I'm one of those people, I like to have it written out. Other people bring bulleted points. Whatever works for you, stick to it. But don't read it. Because you lose all of the wonderful things that we can communicate orally.
Here, just underscore that. On all your notes, just draw a line under what she just said. Please don't read it. There are some conferences where they expect that philosophy of it works that way.
Yeah.
But it's a deadly way to present orally for just the reasons you mentioned.
Think about it as an audience member, for God's sake. Just give me the paper. I'll read it. Just give me the paper. Don't be afraid to say, I don't know. One of the questions that Nora had on her list is, what happens if somebody asks you a question? You can say, that is a very good question. I actually haven't thought about it before. Again, don't masquerade as something you're not. You'll get busted. Don't be afraid to say, I don't know, or I haven't thought about it. Good question. And, jot down a little note if it really was a good question. And lastly, don't take what the audience says to you too personally. Some people are maladapted to social interaction. And take from it what you can. But don't personalize it. Because I've seen what can happen, particularly to people who are nervous, graduate students or early career faculty, and then you have other people in the audience trying to perform something, because you've got these people in the audience who are there for the wrong reasons, and they're really there to present their own stuff, even though they're not on the panel, and they don't really care what you said because they don't like you anyway.
And they may not have heard what you said.
Exactly, but they got something to say.
Very particularly.
Exactly.
What you said.
Exactly. And so, don't take it personally. It's like whatever. If there's something constructive in it, take it. Definitely take it, because it's. The way I, as an audience member, look at it is as a way to, I'm there to kind of learn. And I figure usually this is going to end up in print. So sometimes it's there for me to learn. That's why I ask a question. Sometimes it is there for me to say, have you thought about this? But other people are there. I mean, I'm hoping, depending on how long you are in this career, if you're moving into faculty or wherever it is you're going to be presenting, you'll come across one of these people eventually. I'm hoping it's not this year. That's where you're going. But just take what you can. Take notes and then go back and talk to your advisor or whomever else you trust and say, this is one of the things that was said. Does this make sense? Is this something I should pay attention to? You can have somebody help you sift through it. I'll stop there.
Nora put down a question on one of your lists, Nora, was what should we expect in the questions that get asked of us? And I made a little list here of things that expect a soapbox. Somebody in the room actually wants to say something, not to ask you, but sort of keying off of the theme of the, or maybe not even related to what's in the room. They want to just make a speech, a little speech, so they will do that. And you just listen, politely, quietly, respectfully. Others have great critical questions. It's unusual in the sessions that I've gotten in that I wouldn't get one or two or three that really make me think. And you should be hungry for that. And it has nothing to do with whether you know the answer. The better questions you don't. So you're hungry for that. And I don't even mind asking back to someone who's posed a question. That's a really interesting one that I haven't wrestled with. How do you think about that now? Or do you know about
people
nothing
love
wrong
that?
with that? A third kind of thing that I often get are what I'll just call testimonials. And it's not a speech, it's just they're sort of interested in what you said, and they can think of an example of it, not in your data, but in their experience, or in their own research, or something else they've read. And they just want to put it into public space, and it is a nice contribution to a conversation that's beginning to evolve. It may stimulate other things around the room, so that's happens. And there are other people who just want to kind of probe what you said. They don't quite understand what you did, or their comment suggests that to you that they didn't understand what they did, but they're probing what's there because you only gave them, and once again, in my experience, it's usually 10 to 15 minutes. You didn't give them everything you did. So they don't know everything that's inside of that intellectual structure you've created, so they're probing to figure out what more is there. And you just take the opportunity to give them some more, because there's always more you can say. And so that's another thing that happens. The third kind of thing, fifth kind of thing, seventh kind of thing, don't know what it is a question that's sort of in between people on the panel. It has something to do with what I said. It's something to do with what Jessica said. So maybe I start off, but I can respond by saying, Jessica, how would you respond to that one? How does that relate to your work? And so that gives an opening to somebody else next to you to keep this conversation going, and you'd be surprised how often that'll turn into a really rich conversation that nobody anticipated, least of all the people on the panel, unless they cooked the panel together and sort of knew there would be these possibilities. I don't know if you guys have had experience like that, but it happens often enough for me too.
Well, people ask you questions that you're like, why are you even asking me that? I didn't say anything about that.
Yeah.
They want you to talk about, like, what about World War II with veterans? I wouldn't talk about that. And so you should also practice a game face, because I'm sometimes like, what?
Yeah.
And you don't want to look at people like that. But you have to be, so sometimes it's hard in the moment, right? Especially when you're nervous, to know how to respond.
Yeah.
So to find the right words. I think saying, you shouldn't be afraid to say, I don't know. You shouldn't be afraid to say, I hadn't thought about that. In my work, I've seen this. I haven't seen that. If it's like, or that actually sounds like maybe like you, Jessica, you might have something that you can use those mechanisms. It is hard in the moment, but you can have those in the back of your mind. Now, it's doable. You can do it. You'll survive.
And I think going back to the practicing piece, that's really helpful also for encourage your friends or your colleagues that you're practicing with to also ask you questions.
Yeah.
And
I think it's nice not to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I encourage them. I've had really, I think there was one graduate, she graduated now, but she was really great at asking really critical questions, and I always enjoyed having her practicing with her different things, because that's really important.
Yeah.
Here's one thing that I found from this practicing business, which I completely underscore, practice. You don't have to over-practice, but practice. Here's what happens. If I don't practice, I get into the presentation, I know I've got 15 minutes, and I launch into it, and I sort of discover 10 minutes in, I'm only just wrapping up the framing and the introduction. I sort of go longer to present the beginning part, and then I have to hurry up the back part, and I may even just have very little time for most of the findings and the conclusions. It's because I didn't have it sort of the whole thing in my head. If I practice it, even if the practice goes terribly, I might wait longer, inarticulate, stumbling, fumbling. It doesn't matter whether the practice was good or bad. When I walk into the room, I can compress that front end.
Yes.
I sort of
Because you
know
know it.
by minute 2, I need to be on this thing that's going to launch me in. By minute 5, I need to be there, and I always have my watch in front of me, or make sure there's a clock you can see. So you'd have a very concrete sense of where those minutes are. I just find it compresses that front end. I can move quickly into it.
You can make
Just-
choices.
Yes.
When you know what it is you're presenting and you get hit with this time crunch, you can actually make good choices in your head about what, out of these 8 things, the 2 you have to pick. If you know what you're talking about, you know your presentation, you can make a good choice.
Yeah.
And when
Yeah, jump in.
I was gonna say, when I practice, I usually do it in, I guess, the first time around, I don't necessarily, I'll time myself, but I won't try to speed through it. I'm just trying to see.
How long will it take?
Exactly,
Yeah,
how
yeah.
long will it take? And then I say, oh, it took 15 minutes, okay, let me go back and look at my slides again, or see, and then I'll practice again. So that's been very helpful. And also the first time I practice, sometimes as I'm going through, I realize I should probably change this in my slide, I should probably change that, and I'll go ahead and make notes of that, so I can go back and change them. And it's just kind of like a run through, that's kind of like an editing run through, and then I'll go back and I'll do that a few times until I get to the point, and then I'll take a break, come back another day, and then I'll practice again, timing myself. And I realize that by the time I get to that, and then with the practice with other people, it really helps. I usually get it right on time with that much practice, so,
One last thing is know that you're going to get better at it.
yeah.
So don't, it's something it's literally something you have to practice over and over at conferences, to do it. So, give yourself a pass. You're starting out. You'll get better at it. Know that.
One of my devices for preparing and actually standing there, sitting there, whatever I'm doing, presenting, is never to bring in the actual written words all the way. Or I may have copies of it in my bag or something like that, but I never have that in front of me. I force myself to put all of the notes that I want for this presentation sits on a single sheet. Now, not everyone likes to work this way, but I find, partly for what Georgia said, if I've got a kind of very brief bulleted list with a few phrases all in the order that I'm going, so I can see in one sheet the whole thing. I've got 15 minutes, I see that on my clock here, I see that on the clock there. I've got my whole thing in front of me here, just little bulleted phrases in the order that they go. Then I and I often keep a finger on it as I'm moving along, and so I sort of know where I am. I know how, and I've got enough of it because I've practiced, and because I know it, this is my work. I actually sort of know what there is to say, and I don't feel the need to have just the exact phrasing. This isn't going to come out, the exact
It's not a
phrasing.
script.
And it's not a script, and it's also isn't important for the reasons Joy put on. Verbal presentation is different from writing. And if it gets like writing, it gets too thick.
Oh, yeah.
People can't follow it because the syntax is too complicated. You can see that on the page easily, but speaking, just a few things, and gestures help. And I not only try to have oral markers, I try to have visual spatial markers, and I will, if I'm pointing, like if I use a PowerPoint slide, the slide doesn't do very much. I will go back and forth, I'll put a finger on something on it, and then I'll come back and I'll use my hands to demonstrate where we are in the argument, or something like that. So use all the markers you can, and whatever style works for you, and not everybody feels comfortable doing that way. But that's my way of keeping from reading, and keeping the whole thing kind of in my head and in front of me while I'm doing it, so I just sort of know where I am.
How many of you are doing like a PowerPoint?
Be ready for it to fail.
I have something to hand out to you. Thad's been subjected to this. Jessica probably has been subjected to this. I'm not sure if anyone else has. And I won't present it to you today. If anyone wants it sent to you, I will send it. It's a PowerPoint. It's a 10-minute PowerPoint that I do in the qual method sequence at the end of the year when everyone's getting ready to. They do their own little. You guys did a little conference at the end of the year, presenting your studies, and also you're preparing proposals for real conferences. So I do this 10-minute PowerPoint, which is about 10-minute PowerPoints. It's about what would go into a PowerPoint, what would it look like, how would you present it in 10 minutes, and what's important.
That's great.
So I've got it here. I have copies
That's
for
magic.
each.
That's great.
And it actually fits in exactly 10 minutes, and it will underscore some things about PowerPoints that most of us forget to our peril. Like, for example, most PowerPoint slides I've ever seen have more words on the page than are necessary. In fact, if you have more than about 20 or 30 words on the page, people in your audience won't read them because they can't. They're trying to listen to you, and they're trying to read those words, so there's two things speaking to them at once. And I guarantee you, people don't multitask quite that well. So you want your PowerPoint to have very simple things, just little hooks to hang your remarks on. You are the main event, not the PowerPoint slide. So if the PowerPoint slide's got too much on it, heaven forbid, people will lose you, or they just won't read what's there. So why have it all in there? Anyway, so this demonstration illustrates what that could look like in this kind of a thing, and it's just something for all of you to work on, and you all can. But it's not our nature. Our nature is to take a page out of paper and sort of pull a paragraph or a chunk of it, or even pull a whole table out, plop it into the PowerPoint slide. How many PowerPoint slides have you seen where they've given you the original table from the paper? There's so many numbers, they're tiny, you can't even read the numbers, it's too far away.
And who cares?
Yes, who cares? You couldn't track that.
Right, who cares?
Yes.
Actually, curious about some practical points. So I did it backwards what you suggested. I did a paper presentation at the conference, and now I'm doing a poster presentation in a month. Is there any suggestions, because I haven't done a poster presentation, of ways to make it more engaging, elevator spiel talking points? Because I'm more familiar with the PowerPoint as the structure, so.
You want to start off?
So you said to make it more engaging with the.
So what are some tips to have a good
Yeah.
or a good poster
I would
presentation?
say definitely big fonts.
Big fonts.
The bigger the better. I think when you look up like templates, you'll find certain fonts recommended, like minimum 36, but I actually go really big.
Even bigger?
As big as, yeah.
Yeah, because
36
both the
is
college
just
event and the
kinda-
organization have
Yeah.
presentations that go bigger. Okay.
I would go as big as you can fit. The other thing is definitely bullets and the headlines, like for each category. That's what's going to capture, make people stop. Because you're going to just, not just your title, but then also kind of as you're glancing, sometimes people will glance through the poster, but they won't necessarily stop to like, if you just say findings, it's not really saying much, but it's like if you could say what the finding is, it would be very descriptive as you can.
My center has some pretty good examples from a couple of rounds of doing posters with the CREST program. I'm happy to send you some examples, and sometimes just to have in your mind ways to visualize how do I put the chunks of stuff I want to present without putting too much, because the danger with a poster is the same as the danger of a PowerPoint. You put too much into it, and then people just can't process it all. The processing happens interactively. You just put enough into the poster so they want to know more, and you have this conversation and say, well, tell me, how did you actually get those kind of results? And did you check out this kind of a thing? Or you might even put a little quote sometime, some little glimpses of your data, if it's qualitative even or quantitative help, but you don't want to put too much. And that invites a conversation, and there you are standing, you're ready to talk. So we can give you some examples, and there's also some nice template formats that you could just pick up and start filling things in, and I think that's what Jessica was referring to.
Yeah, and definitely, I feel like there's some tips that I have for PowerPoint that I would say same for a poster, and it's definitely include graphics and images as much as you can.
Yeah.
Whether it's a table, whether it's a graphic, just how things flow, how data connects to each other, whatever you can think of that would help visualize your presentation or what you're trying to say. I found that's more engaging, or it's sometimes easier to present too. Sometimes I have for PowerPoint you can do the animation, you can show certain images and how they interrelate, so I've been able to use that to try to present some of the relationships and my findings.
Yes, I'm a technocrat, so I don't do anything fancy, nice like
That's
what
more than I do.
Jessica just talked about. But I've gotten just a little bit beyond blackboards, though I love blackboards. I would be just as happy
Yeah.
with the blackboard as I would with PowerPoint.
But I was serious when I said be ready for your PowerPoint to fail. You know, you should have a plan B. You should
Yeah.
never just rely on technology.
Oh, great. So you know what I do? That's a great point. So I usually, so there's a couple of things. Sometimes I think things have gotten better in terms of technology. Before there was always issues of just a PC versus a Mac version and the versions. So what I've always done too is I'll actually do a PDF of my PowerPoint and I carry both files because PDFs never fail. You can actually do a slideshow with the PDF. So I've always carried both, and that's happened where the PowerPoint failed, but I had my PDF and I pulled that up.
I actually do three, those two, and I assume the technology itself will fail, like the cords aren't there, or power goes out, or there's a disconnection, or the projector won't project. I assume that, and it's happened to be about 1 time in 20, something like that happens. So I also always, if I'm going to do a PowerPoint or some presentation, go in with just what you got. And I don't give it to them in the beginning unless there is no projection. Then I'll have that thing, and everybody gets in front of them. I said, okay, let's walk through. And then I just have them put a finger, and I have them stay with whichever slide I'm on, rather than leaping through the where's it going kind of thing. That's why I don't give it to people ahead of time. But I have it there, and I almost always will offer it at the end. And if I need it, because the projector doesn't even project, and that's happened to me, then I've got something that gives a structure for the talk and walks people through. So, plan B and plan C.
Definitely. And dongle, if you have a Mac, always bring your adapter.
Yes.
Because
absolutely.
often many conferences don't
Many
provide
times.
that.
And here I've been doing this for 35 years. I should know better. So here I am at UCA this fall, and I'm in the room, and I just didn't remember to bring the dongle, and it wasn't even my main responsibility, but my partner didn't have a dongle, and no one in the room had a dongle. Nobody's there, so what are we going to do? Actually, it was all of us were in the same boat, all of us, all 4 presenters. So I walk out of the hallway, and by chance, Nitya walks by. I didn't even know she was in Washington, D.C. in the hotel. And she's a PhD student, and Nitya was there. I said, Nitya, do you have a dongle? She says, I always carry it. That's me with a dongle, and we're okay. But I had this, so I could have been okay if I had to be, and I've had to be there too. And the other thing about you people are probably all way, way better at this than me, and that's inserting into your PowerPoint slides some little video clips. So I said, I'm going to be a modern man. I'm going to do it. So this is about 8 years ago. I inserted a little 2-minute video clip from a Superman movie because the point that I had to make had to do with how leaders at the higher levels of leadership need support for their leadership work the same way people lower down in the system need support from them. So everyone needs support to do good leadership work. That was my point. So I wanted to start out with that little clip of whichever movie it was. So Lois Lane is 45 stories up at night. Helicopter has crashed into the building, and she falls out of it, and she's falling down this building, and of course Superman gets there in time and catches her in the middle. The video zooms in on them, and he's saying, don't worry, ma'am, I've got you. They're right in the middle. He's middle of the air, 20 stories up. He's flying around holding this lady, and she's saying, yeah, you got me, but who's got you? This is wonderful. See, that's what I wanted to show people because it would have really engaged people. But then I click, the PowerPoint was projecting, and there's this black space in the middle. And don't ask me why it wouldn't project the video clip, but it didn't, and it didn't project the video clip. So then what do? So what I did was verbal, visual, oral markers. I just told the story that I just told you with Lois falling down and being caught, and off we went. So there's generally a way to do this one way or another.
So I see people kind of taking notes and writing down questions. Do you have questions or anything else you want to hear about?
I had a question maybe about, I guess, interaction. So the style of the presentation is a research, like methodology presentation, and so I have 45 minutes, and it'll be the only presenter, and so I'm presenting it on a study, but I'm just trying to figure out, so assuming that, and they didn't say so far in everything I've seen as far as like, you know, I know that the Q&A is included in that, so I'm assuming the last 10 to 15 minutes, so looking at filling 30 minutes or so. But I guess I'm still trying to figure out, like I'll be careful with my PowerPoints not to just be so like 30-minute lecture boring, but I guess I'm trying to figure out what stylistically am I able to do so that I can get some interaction with the audience, especially if it's, the ones I attended last year were, you know, 30 to 40 people in a room for the most part. So it could be a lot smaller, but probably won't be much bigger. So just trying to figure out if any of you had any suggestions or recommendations for how I could have a little bit of interaction within that 30 minutes.
A few things that I've tried, I don't know what the rest of you have done in this, and I haven't often been in a situation, but sometimes. First of all, I make the assumption that people walking into the room basically don't want to do most of the work. They basically want to hear from me or hear with me about whatever the topic is, and time is still short, even if it's 45 minutes. So I'm assuming I'm not going to turn them loose for long periods of time to work on something. But I want them to be able to have input into the conversation and actually kind of get their hands on a little bit of what the topic is about. So I wouldn't hesitate. I've done 3 or 4 things like this. One is make sure I have an index card at every table, and periodically just ask them to put something on the card, like write a question about what you just heard, or turn to a neighbor for 3 minutes and see what both of you would put on the card. I've done that. I often want to give them a tiny little thing to do. I mean tiny. So if it's a methodological presentation and it has to do with something, well, methods now, something to do with the nature of a qualitative claim, I might have on a little piece of paper a handout with a qualitative claim on it, and have everybody have that in their hand and say, just think for a minute, or scribble on this page what kind of evidence you think would support that claim. Just in principle, what kind of evidence would you want to see? Give them 1 minute to do it, no more than that. So they're giving them a little bit of time to do something which will prime the pump, sometimes with a neighbor, sometimes by themselves, and then back into whatever I want to say next. So I don't know whether you guys have done any devices like that, but a little something to do, a little way to track, a little way to engage with a neighbor, just to get, so that I'm just not going straight to 30 minutes and just sort of back and forth like that.
Yeah, so I think it depends on the type of conference, because I've been in conferences where it is more workshop style, so there's definitely the expectation that people want to participate and want their voices to be heard a little bit more.
Do you know what?
Yeah, so I know that, so there were 2 options, like you could choose the more workshop style, and they were going to give you 60 minutes, or you do the 45-minute research presentation.
Okay.
So I think, the ones I attended last year seemed to be, for the most part, they were almost all pretty lecture-y type. But I was just like thinking of a couple little tips to have a little more.
I think what happened to me once is I actually had a presentation, and then it was like supposed to be 3 presenters, and then one didn't show up, so the chair gave us more time, so I ended up having like 30 minutes. But it went by fast, even though I had presented for 15 minutes, practiced for 15 minutes. I just took a better pace, and I feel like I was able to use opportunities to provide more inflection in pieces that I wanted to emphasize, but also maybe have more engagement in the Q&A as well. So, I don't know.
My suggestions would be like a quick poll. So, this, so how many of you use this? And then, they're not actually talking, so it's still a little audience. People still like, it's still participation, right? Or a very specific question. So for those of you who said, yes, you've used this, how have you used it? And you just call in a couple people, say, oh, okay, and so this, because you have to master the time. That is the problem with having audience interaction in the middle of your 30 minutes. I think it's a great thing, because I think 30 minutes is a long time to sit and listen. I think it's actually too long to sit and listen. And so I love the fact that you're thinking about these things. So like a quick poll of the room on something where people aren't actually speaking is a way to do, or like a very specific question that you can respond to, and you call on a couple people, but you have to keep a very close watch on the time because they will eat it up if you allow them to. So those are two things that I can think of off the top of my head where you can get some audience participation, but you're still in control.
Yeah, you really want to keep that kind of control of the time so that you could turn it off the same way you turned it on.
Exactly.
But it's enough of it just to get people with you.
Yeah,
and
I think people will love it.
Yeah, typically it
Yeah,
doesn't take a lot.
I think the starting with the question, or having a question at some point when it's relevant to your work, it's definitely something that I found people like to. It helps them personalize it a little bit.
We haven't said much here, but we probably ought to put on the table that there's really quite a wide range of different of presentation formats. So I made my little list of workshop type, basic, standard, presentation of a paper like this. It's a paper session, 2, 3, 4, 5 papers being presented, each of you with a little time and a little Q&A at the end. Maybe a discussant has time to talk, maybe he doesn't. That's a standard thing. Then there's symposiums where all of you were accumulated, and maybe you set up the symposium because you have a common theme and a common topic, each with a different vantage point on it. And so those are typically a little more interactive. They're meant to be. And so that you and your panel mates would want to figure out how can we make this a little more interactive. Then there are roundtables, which are AERA is doing a huge move on now. Because
I had a round table, nobody showed up, so I was saying, I didn't take it for, I hurt my feelings for a little while, but I got over it. Oh, can I tell you this? This drives me nuts. Titles are important. Nobody's going to come to your talk if it's about the tsetse fly and mating rituals in some season. Who cares about? Call it something else. Insects on the move, or
sex and insects.
Exactly, sex and insects. It drives me nuts. So the Association for the Study of Higher Education. Some of these, I don't go, but my husband does. And I've looked at some of the titles. It's like, I don't even need to go to the talk. Because you basically told me everything in the title. And it doesn't actually look that interesting. And so I tell my students this all the time. Yes, you're doing a case study. But don't put that before the colon. Nobody wants to know about this one woman in 1863 in this, Utah. Who cares? What does she tell you about something bigger? And have that in some kind of way reflected in the title. Titles drive me nuts. And now I'm a co-editor of a journal, and I'm all over that now. I'm all over it. Because you want people to come. So you want to be honest about what it is you're going to present. But for God's sake, try and be creative about it. I'm going to stop. So are there other questions or thoughts?
Do you have, what are your thoughts on, how I submitted my proposal, got accepted, yay, all that is great. And so now that I'm developing the workshop, a part of me wants to not just ditch my entire proposal, but making changes to your initial proposal.
Yeah.
How far off should you go, or how should you just stick to what you wrote?
So I'm going to tell you, do as I say, not as I do. I proposed something, by the time I got there, that's like what I was working on. So I used to say to the audience, so I know what the title is, but that's actually not what I'm going to talk about today.
Okay.
And people were like, wait a minute, it's related. You still don't get something out of it.
Yeah.
But you have to remember that people that okayed your proposal are not necessarily the same people in the audience, and they won't remember what it was you proposed. As long as you're in the title range, that's another reason to have a broader than narrow title. That's what I mean. That's why I do it like so. Who knows? It's a surprise. This is what I'm talking about today. Because you don't want to lock yourself in too tight. And so, I wouldn't necessarily advertise the fact that you can change up what it is you're going to say.
Okay.
I wouldn't write that. You can't put my name by that and pass it out in college. But it can be done.
And it is
things
often.
change. It is often. Things
yeah.
change. There are months between when you thought of this and then you finally did it.
Yeah.
You don't know. It's like your thesis, your dissertation. You think you thought you knew what you were going to write on. That's not what you're doing, right?
Yeah.
It's okay.
It's absolutely
as long as
okay.
it's in the family.
Yeah, okay.
They're not gonna. Nobody's
Okay.
gonna be there like, wait a minute. This was his proposal. He's not.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it also it reflects a very honest thing about research. It's an evolutionary process, and you propose something in July to get into next spring's AER, I just keep using that as an example, but there's a 9-month period of
Yeah.
time. You've actually hopefully progressed in your thinking from the point at which you proposed, and now you really sort of have a better grasp on it. But the better grasp means probably a different title, and maybe a different emphasis and flavor to it, and certainly different conclusions. Fine, that is what scholarship's all about.
I wouldn't
It's-
advertise that, I shouldn't have advertised that, I'm the smartest move I've ever made. But I said, it worked out, I'm okay, I'm here.
Right.
My point is, you can make mistakes and you will survive.
Yeah.
Look, you will make mistakes. You will survive. It's a presentation, it's not surgery.
Thank the Lord.
Yes.
One thing that I know is not related directly to the presentation, but it is to being at a conference, especially a national conference. It's definitely an opportunity to network. And I feel like that's where I've met, because I'm in higher ed, I haven't had a lot of people that have the exact same interests here on campus or even in the state. But nationally, I'm able to make a bigger cohort kind of group.
Yeah.
And so we've actually created symposiums out of these, getting to know each other at these national conferences and realizing, hey, your work is on experiential learning, so is mine. Let's try to do a symposium. And so that's been an opportunity to network and networking, meeting, building relationships with others that you can actually collaborate with and do additional presentations in the future. So.
Yeah, Dan, you're on board.
I know, I'm on a roll. Advice on when you have a not so great session time, i.e. my session is the last session of the day, and so knowing that I'm thinking of my audience, we've all been here since 9 o'clock, you come to my 4 o'clock presentation, or even if it was at the after lunch hour presentation, how do you wake up your crowd or keep them alive?
And people have different solutions to this. My solution is to dwell as little as possible on recognizing that fact. Maybe half of a sentence, one-liner, and dive right in. Don't let them wait for you. Don't give them any space, but just dive right in with some degree of excitement and enthusiasm. They'll pick up on you. You're the kind of main event here for your presentation, and if you come in with energy, even at 4 p.m. on Saturday, they will respond with energy. They'll pick up on your energy. If you sort of are apologetic about it, I know it's the end of a long day, and we've had a really tough time.
They're there.
And we all want to go to the bar.
Yeah.
Well, then everyone wants to go to the
Yeah.
bar.
Like,
They
I
don't want to
wasn't
hear
even
you.
thinking about going to the bar until you said it.
Yeah.
But even some of the strategies we were talking about, whether like a quick poll or like a quick, just, but I think remember, they're there. And so then that's when you put on your show to keep them to keep them engaged. They're there.
I've never done this, but maybe you guys have. One such thing. Late in the day, everyone was clearly hurting. Well, stand up, please. Everybody stood up. I didn't do this. And all stood up, and the presenter just started presenting with everybody standing up, and then let us sit down after about a minute or two. That's all it took. Just a little bit of blood getting to the brain and back down again. We were fine. Had us in the palm of his hand. Just little things like that.
Yeah.
I think I've been lucky. My latest has always been at 2 o'clock.
Oh, you were lucky.
But
Yeah.
sometimes you get like
But I haven't
8:15,
presented as much, so
you
I'm
have
not sure
lunch.
the chances of that.
4:30. Try teaching a class here at 7. You know, you've been in classes. No, it's the same thing. Like if any of you have a teaching background, it's the same thing. It's still an audience. You're still the one in the front. You're performing. You're teaching/performing.
A couple of things that we haven't touched on quite, but maybe we sort of have. One is just has to do with the number of people in the room. That's totally irrelevant. It could be 1, it could be 2, it could be 30, it could be 100. It doesn't matter how many people are in the room. The goal is to have a really engaging, good conversation with whoever's there. And we had a good conversation in Chicago that time. 6 of us plus 1 person in a room that could hold 600. We just circled up and we did it. So you may want to rearrange. And Nora was joking at the beginning, if it was only a couple of you were here at that time, maybe we just sit around the table. Sure, sit around the table. Do whatever kind of rearranging of the space sets the stage for that engaging conversation. That's my philosophy, and it's paid off so many times. I've done lots and lots of presentations, and they go from the hundreds down to the 1, 2s, and 3s. You can have a great conversation no matter how many are there. I don't know what you guys have found.
Yeah.
I don't think we've really talked about this, but when you are co-presenting with somebody else, maybe talk about, I guess, how you went about like determining like what, strategizing like who was saying what, or what a co-presentation might look like, or maybe good stories versus bad stories.
And whoever's going first, they will eat up that second, but you better hope you're first. Oh God, it's the practice. These go horribly awry regularly because the people who are first are not paying attention to the time. It's like the Oscars or the Emmys, and there's a group of people up there, and they start playing music when the first person is finally done, and the second person just wants to thank his or her family, but they can't because the first person took off.
If you mean, Nora, and let me just double check, let's say Joy and I had written a paper together, and we're both on the program, we both want to be visible, we both want to talk a little bit. That's something that is under your control a little bit. So you got your 15 minutes. So Joy and I sit down and figure, okay, Joy, how are we going to divide up our 15 minutes? You do this topic up to here, and I'll sit in line and I'll flag you if your time goes over. So then we've divided up, and that's a way you can deal with the co-presenting, and that you can control that. But if you're at the whim of the other people's lack of time management, then you're just in the boat. There was one. This was an interesting one. I was a discussant in this one, in which one of the three presentations in whatever the normal session was. One of the three presentations had 7 authors.
No.
And the 7 authors all presented. They were determined. And they actually had worked it out. It sort of worked. They had, I think, 15. They might have had 20 minutes. But I think
Too
it was
disruptive
15.
for the audience.
It was.
We
We can discuss whether this is a good way or not. But there were these 7 people. 6 of them they each had a sort of a piece of the puzzle that sat inside their school. There were 6 teachers and a researcher, and it was a kind of a action research thing that had a different manifestation in different people's classrooms. They had worked it out so that you actually did get a nugget out of each one, and they practiced the time. So they didn't go over time. I would never have chosen to do it that way, but they did, and I was complimentary as a discussant. It actually did sort of work, but it's a little hard. And when you're co-authors, you don't always have to co-present equally. You can just one of you could do the honors and just acknowledge the other or whatever. So.
One thing I would say is definitely road interruptions, because I've seen people who are co-presenters who are just 2 people, but they'll be person A, then person B, then person A, then person B. I would say don't do that. I would say just do person A, person B, because it just becomes too disruptive, and then they stop, and then it just messes up the flow of the presentation, and you're killing time. So yeah.
You wouldn't believe how fast 15 minutes would go.
Oh God, especially when
So-
it's divided by 7.
So short.
For me, in the audience, I would have just been waiting for who's next. That's all I probably would have stopped listening. Okay, so let's see how they're going to do this. I literally would have stopped.
Yes.
It becomes a form of entertainment at that point.
I think I missed the most part of that. But I have a question. Do you have to present a completed study for your presentation, or maybe is it possible you could present when you were still in the progress of your not completed study? You have some kind of sense of the study, and you want to present.
You can do that. Typically, to get accepted into the program, the assumption of most conferences is that you have a complete piece of work.
Yeah.
Now, the complete piece of work might be part of a longer study. You might be presenting your conceptual framework, or something about your lit review, or you might be presenting just a part of an ongoing study with different kinds of data collection and analysis going on. But to propose, you probably will have proposed it as if it's a complete piece of
Yeah.
work. That said, many good presentations are really sort of preliminary findings, ongoing findings. This is essentially a work in progress conversation, but it has some kind of semi-completeness to it. You can do wonderful presentations about work that's not complete. Work is never complete.
Yeah, it's never complete. What I did, like the last conference I presented at, I just presented basically a part of my first research question for my dissertation, just to try to get me some feedback and see if people think this sounds right. So even just doing that, taking, just not necessarily, you don't have to have the entire study complete, but maybe you've already analyzed the work of one of those questions, so that becomes your entire conference.
And I'm her witness because I'm
So
helping
he's
her
my
with the
chair, he's the one who read
dissertation.
everything.
We talked yesterday, and she's midway through chapter 4, so she presented part of chapter 4. That's
Yeah.
simply what it was.
And that's what helped me think how to
Absolutely
present.
made sense,
So,
yeah.
so I actually shared in my one of the diagrams I used for the conference, because like this is what it helped me. It helped me think through how I was going to present, helped me really think through how I'm even going to write about it. So I would encourage you to, as soon as you have something that you think you have some sort of like preliminary findings around, to present them, because that's where you get the opportunity to actually test it out and also make yourself push yourself to think a little bit more through it.
Okay. But when you apply for that, you have to let them know the whole sense of your project.
Yeah, usually you have, so I gave my preliminary findings when I applied in my proposal, and then 6 months later my preliminary findings were fleshed out a little bit more, so it's kind of what we were saying earlier, that it may not be exactly the same, but I had fleshed them out a little bit more, and I said, oh, okay, I think this is what I figured out. And I try to keep it as broad as possible too. My title was more of like the role of place and people in how students navigate the college kind of thing.
See,
So I
that's
wasn't
the
saying, oh, this is what they did. I was just saying that you're going to learn about what the role of place and people are. So
Even if all you're getting is just one piece of what I will ultimately have to say about it, my topic and my title embraces it all, and I'm going to give you the piece that I have done. Now, here it is. That's fine. Okay, wonderful sessions. Conferences are often sort of an interim step, a stepping stone to further, more finished, more done research. So very often you find people are sort of in midstream. It's a good place to be.
Yeah, and that reminds me of the other project I was on. It was a big team. So we presented. We've been presenting for this the parent engagement research, and when we presented 2 conferences in 1 year, and at the end of that year we went back and we changed everything. So it's kind of like the conferences helped us rethink about it, and helped us think about, okay, what are our findings saying, and what are we need to reconceptualize how we were thinking about it. So it's not necessarily set in stone.
Those of you who are thinking about becoming faculty, you should seriously think about translating your conference proposals and papers into publications, because conference papers and presentations aren't going to get you promoted. It's the publication. So you can use these conferences as a way to get feedback, to make connections, to learn more, to turn it into a publication, if that's your goal. I have a lot of conference presentations on my Vita that were not published. Again, learn from my mistakes. That's something, I remember being told that, I just didn't listen as closely as I should have.
I found that I'm in the same situation. I've always thought of conference presentations as a way to try out some ideas, and sometimes you try them out and they sort of don't work, and you say, well, that's not worth it. I'm not going to try to publish that one just because it would take too much work, or the study wasn't right for that. Or, I'm glad I said it. It's out there. Yes, it goes on the Vita, but it's not one of those things I'm going to invest 4, 5, 6 months on and really try to get it out there. But many of them can be, and it's a good way to think about what you're doing. This is a stepping stone to something else, and the something else, if that is your career track and that is your professional goal, is get it out in a more permanent, accessible way. So, good time to do that. I have a short list of things to remember to walk into the room with.
Well, first,
Yes.
are there other, let's see if there are other questions.
Go ahead.
Is it hard, like, to, is it hard to find a national company that would accept your proposal? And, yeah, I'm just wondering, is the bar very high, or do you have?
It varies, I think, by discipline area and by conference. AERA accepts 1 out of 3 on average. In some sections in AERA, it's more like 1 out of 2. In some, it's more than 1 out of. So, yeah, is it hard? Yeah, you have to do a good job. UCEA, University Council for Education Administration, accepts approximately 75 to 80% of what it gets. So is it hard? It's much easier to get accepted there, but they still turn things down. So it really varies by conference. I don't know about the one conferences you guys go to, what the success rate
I don't know the
is.
rates, but I know they can be at things like AERA. There's definitely. But what I found, when I found my proposals to be successful, what I have done is I've looked for other examples of proposals for the same conference. So that's definitely the thing I would recommend, and for the same type of presentation that you want to present. So AERA has symposium, roundtables, research paper style. So I would try to find a colleague who has maybe a sample of whichever one I'm hoping to get into, and that has really helped me think about how to write the proposal and the organization for it.
You can ask your advisor to take a look at the proposal, because hopefully that person has been presenting at conferences and knows what to look for. You don't know if you've never done it. They'll say you need these 5 things in your proposal, and you think you're doing that, but you've never done it before, so you don't know. You're not part of that culture yet. So you can, getting an example and asking advice from your advisor.
I have to say, might help me with my first proposal, and ever since then, I think I would just take that one and kind of adapt.
And you've got an increasing number. You've got 5 that have been accepted, 10 that have been accepted. They become a kind of little library for you of different formats that work for you in different conferences. And then you just grow that collection over time. And it gets easier over time. But it's always some work. You actually have to work hard. Yeah.
So my name is Christy, and I'm going to my very first conference. And I guess what I'm afraid of is that the culture, the environment is all intimidating to me, because I have never been. I don't know what to expect once I hit the ground, where I guess everything is going to be intimidating. So if you have a piece of advice so that I don't have so much anxiety not knowing anyone or not.
Are you going, you won't, nobody else is going from here or any friends?
There's someone going from here, but I forgot to get the name. I'm from the Bothell campus, but I know that there's one person going from here to the same conference, and I forgot to.
Which conference is this?
Critical Questions in Education.
Is it a big conference, small conference? Do you have any sense of that? Never been. Yeah.
Never been.
Yeah, neither have I.
I don't know, but I guess my question is, if you have one piece of advice, so the anxiety level is a little low, what would it be?
What do you do for stress relief now?
Jog.
Then you should go for a jog that morning. I mean, you really have to, it's kind of like, this is what I tell my students about writing your dissertation. I can tell you how I did mine, but you got to write it whatever works for you. And so whatever works for you, like with stress reduction now, is what you should employ when you're there, or you're going to get so wound up, you're not going to sleep. And also, get in contact with that person who's here and have a plan in the audience. When I first started presenting, I had all my and they never asked me a question, but they were just there smiling at me and nodding along. You understand what I'm saying?
You can even plant a very easy softball question.
Yeah.
And ask them to ask you that, and then that makes you feel way better.
Yeah.
Oh
yeah, and nobody needs to know.
We were talking about practicing your presentation. Don't have to over-practice, because that may crank up the anxiety, but having practiced a couple of times, probably before you even get there. I don't mean 10 minutes before or half an hour before in the hotel corridor, and I've seen people do that. That's probably not going to lower the anxiety level, but having done it a day or 2 or 3 or a week before with some friends that you trust, you just can't know until you're there how much that will help you. You will just have a sort of picture in your head of what you want to say.
Yeah.
And so please practice. That's a very, very important thing. With people you know and trust and are going to be supportive of you. That's one of the biggest things. And so at least that part of the conference, you've got knowledge. You know your stuff, you have something important to say, and you say it, and you're all ready to do that. So
See you tomorrow.
Come on in, you're welcome.
Hello. You know, we have a class in here at
4:30.
Yeah.
At 4:30.
But you can talk. We're talking about presentation. So that's one of the biggest stressors I've noticed, and I've felt it in myself, is that I go to a conference, say the conference is 3 days. I'm on the afternoon of the second day. It's kind of like there's this trajectory going to the afternoon of the second day, and anxiety's building up, and then after that, it's easy sailing from there on. So you gotta want to figure out when in the conference is your thing. Give yourself a little space ahead of time so that you're not running from something else if possible, that you can actually get to the room early. Like I typically like to get the half an hour early. If there's some other session there, I'll go sit in the back just so that I'm not just physically trying to get there, and that cranks up my anxiety. So I just get there on time. Always introduce myself to all the people I don't know in the panel. I try to introduce myself to as many people in the room as I can, so I don't feel like I'm a stranger surrounded by strangers. And generally try to communicate ahead of time with whoever the chair of the session is or the organizer of the session by email, and have, of course, try to send my paper ahead of time, do whatever that you're supposed to do, and then you'll feel connected. You feel connected at least to that group and that place and that event, and it just sort of helps you feel a little less of a stranger in a place where you're just not used to being there. Then there are other little devices that surrounding that time. There are generally some reception times or some, where they're just times where people gather, like they'll have coffee in the hallway or they'll have receptions in the evening that are open to everybody. Just make sure to get yourself to those. Get yourself as early as you can and as hungry as you can, and position yourself next to the food or the drinks or both. And people will want to talk. They actually want to.
Because you're in the way, you're between them.
Yes,
and them.
yes.
They have to talk.
And you can strike up a conversation or 2 or 3, and you just have to bite your lip and say, okay, I don't know a soul here, but I'm just curious. Nora, oh, your name's Nora. Oh, tell me about where you're coming from and what have you been doing here, and here's what I'm all interested in. And it may go nowhere, but just the act of having some of these conversations will make you feel more connected. The other thing to do, I find, this is just my solution, all the other sessions you go in with some way of taking notes, and you force yourself to write down at least one question that you would put to the people who presented. And when it's a panel, I try to have a question for everyone. And you put up your hand in Q&A and try to ask at least one of those if there's time and if they recognize you. And if there isn't, you go up to the panel at the end and you say, Jessica, I really wanted to ask you something about what you're doing. And you have to really want to. I mean, you have to really have a question. And you ask her and you listen to what she says. It doesn't take too many of those before you sort of feel, I'm part of this group. I'm part of the conversation that's going on here. I have something I want to know from them. They stimulated my thinking, and more often than not, the panelists really want to. They, first of all, they've had someone heard what they said, and even had some questions about it. And that can sometimes lead to a conversation in the hallway. It can lead to a cup of coffee at the end of the day or the next morning. And it doesn't take too many of those before you're there. You feel like, I belong here, I'm part of it. It's just some things I've done. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah, I think the other thing, I think all of those are great. I think the other thing I do in terms of so you're presenting at this conference, I think, so I do like to come in early to the hotel like the night before my presentation. I like to make sure I'm there.
Find the room.
Yeah, and I also, the night before, I also like to go to my hotel room and actually practice it again, just so that I can like hit the pillow feeling, okay, I've at least run through it once before I go to sleep, and then the next day I'll go to the presentation. Just make sure you're never hungry. I think I tried doing a presentation once hungry, and I was going brain dead. It was not good. So that's the one thing I would say is actually, and the other recommendation I would try to do is be careful about proposing for 2 presentations in one conference, because I ended up having 2 presentations on the same day, which is why I went without eating, and then I was like super hungry, and then I was like brain dead by the second presentation. So I don't think I ever want to do that again.
You have to start somewhere. If this is going to be your community, you got to pick a first time to go. Might as well go now. And congratulations for getting on the program.
Yeah, no, that's neat. You'll have a great time.
I used to have the J-O-Y. That's what I was having, the J to the O to the Y. That's how I had to hype myself up. 'Cause I get tired. I'm nervous, so I'd be like, yawn, I'd yawn. I'm trying not to yawn, but I just sit down with the J. Wow. Do this. And then, I tank. But no, but I've gotten better. You have to start somewhere.
On eating. I don't like to go hungry, but I don't like to go too well fed. There was one presentation once upon a time when I had one of those huge big breakfasts that you can get at the smorgasbord. You pay your thing and you go back. And I went back a second time, so I had all this huge breakfast in me. And I was presenting at 10 o'clock in the morning. At 9:57, my stomach was churning, and I had to make a beeline for the bathroom, and I get back there just in time. That was not the right way to do it. So I have a small break. I don't want to go hungry. I don't want to go hungry, but I don't want to go too well fed.
Yeah.
So that's just me.
Yeah, and I've learned to just bring like little those granola bars, things like
those are
that,
great.
so that I can make sure I eat that even if I'm running around, just to make sure I'm not hungry.
One little tiny thing, pay attention to the other people on the panel. Just out of courtesy. You want them to do the same for you. You don't want them to be up there distracting people. You might not actually be listening to everything they're saying because you're running through your presentation in your head. Every once in a while, look at them and go,
Yeah.
write down some, sometimes I write in cursive the alphabet. Yeah, I'll be A, B, C, D, F, G, H, I. Just out of, you're part of a panel. And, you act like it.
One thing I found on that score, say you're second, there's 4 people and you're number 3. There's 4 and you're number 3. It's so hard to make yourself really hear what number 1 and 1 or 2 said. But number 4, you got it.
Yeah.
You're ready
awake.
because
Yeah.
you've done your thing and now you really can listen. But once again, back to what I said before, I try to push myself to have at least, as I listen, just something that I can put a hand on that they said. Maybe it's just a phrase. The rest is alphabetic. But at least I can pick up a phrase that has something that they said and then on to the next. And of course I'm working more on my thing. And I get done with my thing and then I work harder on that. And it's real. You're not competing with each other.
Yeah.
You're actually co-presenting in a way, even if your topics are kind of different.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Good luck, all of you. You can
Yeah,
do it.
go for it.
Break a leg.
Yeah.